Most people think they understand addiction until it happens to them or someone they love. At first glance, addiction might seem like a simple failure of willpower, a bad habit, a destructive pattern, something a person could stop if they truly wanted to, if they just tried hard enough. But this way of thinking is misleading and dangerously shallow. It reduces a complex inner struggle to a matter of choice, ignoring the invisible storms happening beneath the surface. Carl Jung, one of the most profound explorers of the human psyche, saw things differently. To him, addiction wasn't about weakness or moral failure. It was a broken, yet deeply human, attempt to reach something sacred, something meaningful. Behind every addiction, Jung believed, there is a story that hasn't been told, a silence that hasn't been broken, a gap between who we are and who we long to become. Addiction, then, is not simply an escape. It's a symptom, a signal from deep within that something essential has been lost. For Jung, the addict wasn't someone to be judged, but someone who had lost connection with their inner center, that vital, organizing force that gives direction and meaning to a person's life. There's a quote often attributed to Jung: "No addict heals without a spiritual experience." And those words carry weight, not as poetry, but as truth, because the real issue isn't the drug. It's not the behavior. It's not even the dependence. The real issue lies in what that dependence represents: a desperate, unconscious search for something deeper, a hunger for meaning, for connection, for wholeness. Often, the person struggling doesn't even know what they're searching for. They just feel a heaviness, a restlessness, a sense of emptiness they can't explain. And so they reach outward, to alcohol, to pills, to pleasure, to screens, trying to quiet a voice inside that refuses to be silenced. But these are only substitutes, stand-ins for what they truly crave: purpose, unity, a relationship with something greater than themselves. But the relief they find, it never lasts. It soothes the ache for a few hours, maybe a few days, and then the emptiness returns, heavier, louder, closer. The cycle begins again, and with each turn it digs deeper, because the more we try to fill that inner void with something external, the further we drift from what's really causing the pain. Jung saw this not as weakness, but as a spiritual signal. The soul, he believed, is hungry for truth, for depth, for authenticity. Addiction, in this light, is not just a bad habit. It's a cry that rises from the unconscious, from that hidden part of us that aches to be whole, that wants life to mean something. In many ancient cultures, substances that alter the mind were used sparingly and only within sacred rituals. They weren't consumed to escape reality, but to enter more deeply into it, to touch the divine, to commune with mystery. But in today's world, where the symbolic and the spiritual have been stripped away, these same substances are used recklessly, not to connect with something higher, but to fill a void that no longer has a name. And in that, there's a tragedy, because without a structure of meaning, without inner guidance, the search for transcendence becomes a fall. The substance no longer opens the soul. It fragments it. It doesn't expand consciousness. It breaks it apart. Jung believed that reason alone is not enough to live by. Human beings need more than logic. We need myths, images, symbols, things that give shape to what we carry inside. And when those inner symbols fade or lose their power, the soul begins to wither. And when the soul is sick, it reaches for healing any way it can. Addiction then becomes a flawed but honest effort to heal something invisible, something ancient, something sacred. That's why Jung's ideas became a cornerstone in the early stages of recovery programs, like Alcoholics Anonymous. Its founder, Bill Wilson, was deeply moved by a letter Jung had written, one that said healing doesn't come from discipline alone. It doesn't come from force or rules. It comes from within, from the birth of something new, a spark, a shift, a spiritual awakening. Only then can a person rediscover their center. Only then does life begin to regain meaning. When viewed through this lens, addiction isn't just a pattern that needs fixing. It's a signal, a flare from the soul, saying something is broken, something is missing. And like every true crisis, it carries within it the seed of possibility, the chance to stop running, to turn inward, to begin a different kind of search, one not for escape, but for meaning. Jung never spoke of curing addiction like a disease. He wasn't interested in suppressing symptoms. His goal was to help the person see that what they were chasing through addiction was something they were meant to find inside themselves. Recovery for him wasn't just about quitting. It was about remembering, about returning to who you are, beneath the pain, beneath the hunger, beneath the noise. The suffering of the addict, as heavy as it may be, carries a hidden truth. It reveals that something inside is still alive, still reaching, that beneath the despair there is still a spark, a faint but undeniable longing for something real. And in that longing lies hope, a hope that refuses to die, even when buried under fear, confusion, or shame. That's what makes real transformation possible, because it is not punishment that changes a person. It is meaning, and meaning only begins to take root when everything else has fallen apart, when a person reaches the bottom and starts to look at life from below the surface. Many who struggle with addiction speak of a deep emptiness. They can't quite name it, but they feel it, as if something essential is missing, though they don't know what. Jung understood what that missing piece truly was. It wasn't a drug. It wasn't pleasure or escape. It was a totality of the psyche, the full self, including the parts that have been rejected, forgotten, or silenced. What the addict truly longs for isn't the substance, but what it stands for: comfort, belonging, love, power, redemption, connection. At the core, they are trying to return to something essential, a part of themselves that was split off through pain or trauma. And here lies one of Jung's most powerful insights. Addiction is symbolic. It speaks in the language of the soul, a language that isn't logical, but deeply meaningful. The symptoms aren't random. They are messages, clues, signals from the unconscious. Addiction is the soul's way of saying something is out of balance. Something needs to be heard. But hearing that message takes courage, because it requires looking inward, not to excuse destructive behavior, but to understand where it comes from and how it can finally be transformed. This view of the addict isn't romantic, and it isn't naive. It's radically human, because it sees beyond the behavior and into the story, beyond the habit and into the symbol, and beyond the symbol into the potential for change. When someone seeks relief through addiction, they rarely understand why. They don't sit down and analyze their motives. They don't make a conscious decision to harm themselves. There's a part of them that simply takes over. It pulls the strings. It leads them again and again into darkness they swore they'd never return to. That part is what Jung called the shadow. And the shadow is not evil. It's not a demon or a flaw. It is the sum of everything we've pushed away. The thoughts we weren't allowed to think. The feelings we were told to hide. The memories that hurt too much to carry. We reject those parts. To be accepted. To survive. To fit in. But what is repressed doesn't disappear. It waits. It morphs. And when ignored for too long, it finds a way out. One of those ways is addiction. At its core, addiction is a war inside the self. On one side, the part that wants control, approval, success. On the other, the shadow, carrying rage, grief, fear, shame. Instead of facing that inner tension, the person tries to silence it, to numb it, to bury it. But the shadow does not stay buried. It resurfaces in sudden impulses, in self-sabotage, in moments where the person feels like a stranger to themselves. And often, they don't realize they are fighting their own reflection. They think the enemy is the substance, the craving, the temptation, the outside world. But the true battle is happening within. One part wants to release the pain. Another part wants to pretend it isn't there. This creates a constant pressure, an anxiety without a clear cause, a weight that slowly crushes the spirit. Even after quitting, many addicts feel worse, empty, restless, depressed. They wonder, if the substance is gone, why do I still feel like this? The answer is simple, but hard to face, because the substance was never the root. It was a bandage, and beneath it, the wound is still open. In many cases, addiction is tied to old wounds, to pain that was never truly processed. Abuse, abandonment, humiliation, emotional neglect. These experiences don't just vanish with time. They sink into the unconscious, but they continue to shape behavior, quietly, relentlessly. The shadow holds those memories. Even if the conscious mind forgets, the body remembers. The nervous system remembers. The ache remains. Repeated use of a substance becomes a way, not to seek pleasure, but to avoid reunion with that pain. But the more a person runs from it, the stronger it becomes. And eventually, the shadow stops hiding. It begins to project itself onto the world. The addict starts to see threats where there are none. They distrust love, pull away from connection, feel trapped in a world that seems hostile, indifferent, or fake. But that perception is distorted, shaped by wounds that haven't healed. And the more they reject what's within, the more it haunts them from without. This is a tragic loop. The outside becomes a mirror, reflecting the pain that has been pushed away, and healing seems impossible. But there's a deeper layer still, a spiritual one, because facing the shadow is not just psychological work. It is a sacred act, an act of surrender and courage. It is the moment a person stops pretending and stands naked before their own truth. It is a recognition that light and darkness both live within us, and only by embracing both can we begin to feel whole again. Addiction stops being a sentence when we understand it as an invitation, a call to go inward, to listen, to remember what was forgotten, and bring it back into the light. This perspective doesn't take away responsibility. It doesn't justify the harm addiction can cause, to the self or to others, but it changes the way we meet it, not with blame, not with shame, but with understanding, so that the pattern can be broken at its root. When the shadow is brought into awareness, it loses its grip. You stop being its victim and begin to form a more honest relationship with yourself, no longer controlled by impulses that once seemed unstoppable, no longer blindly acting out what has never been faced. In many lives, addiction is a mask. Underneath it, buried experiences, emotions that never had space to breathe. Sometimes, what fuels the cycle isn't the present. It's the past, screaming from beneath the surface. Trauma that wasn't named. Wounds that were never validated. And as long as they remain buried, they control the show. The substance just becomes the actor, but the pain is the script. And when the person tries to stop, the story doesn't end. It finds a new costume. From alcohol to work, from drugs to food, from sex to screens, the behavior changes, but the pattern stays, because the root is still untouched, still waiting. Integrating the shadow is not quick work. It's not easy. It requires honesty, patience, and a fierce kind of love. It means looking in the mirror without filters. It means welcoming the parts you once feared and learning to speak their language. It means stopping the blame and beginning the listening. When this begins, the addict no longer sees the addiction as the enemy. They see it as a messenger, a symbol, a voice that said, something needs a change. This doesn't mean the damage didn't happen. It doesn't erase the harm, but it offers a path forward, one built not on perfection, but on truth, because when the shadow is faced, with presence and care, It starts to speak, not in words, but in images, in emotion, in memory, in vision. Jung called this process individuation, the journey of becoming whole, not by rejecting your wounds, but by integrating them, by understanding that the pain has something to teach. Many who have walked this path describe it not as recovery, but as a rebirth, because they didn't just stop using. They died to the old version of themselves, the version that was surviving, but not living, and in that symbolic death, something new began to grow. The fire that once burned became purification. The darkness that once suffocated became fertile ground. What seemed unbearable became a doorway. No therapist, no guide, no method can do this for someone. The external support can help, but it cannot substitute the inner work. The real alchemy happens in silence, when the soul stops running and begins to listen. In that moment, what once looked like a story of failure becomes the beginning of a deeper journey. The pain doesn't vanish, but it changes. It becomes a guide, a compass, a map. Suffering is no longer just something to survive. It becomes something to understand, to honor, to transform, because addiction at its core isn't just a disease. It's a lost search for transformation, a desperate need for meaning, gone off course. But the wrong turn doesn't cancel the destination. In fact, it makes the search even more real, more urgent, more sacred. Only those who have collapsed can learn how to rebuild with truth. In that rebuilding, a symbol begins to emerge, not from books, not from rules, but from within, a dream, a vision, a moment of clarity, something that speaks the soul's language. Jung called it the organizing center of the inner life, a living image that gives direction, that gives meaning, and it doesn't come when forced. It appears when the pain has been heard, when the soul feels safe enough to speak. And once it speaks, the whole path begins to shift. What once seemed like broken pieces start to form a map, not a return to what was, but the birth of something entirely new. That's why every culture has myths, rituals, archetypes, because they help the human being cross the threshold, to die to who they were, and rise into who they can become. The addict at their core doesn't just need to stop using. They need to let go of the old story, the identity built on survival, and step into something more honest, more whole, more alive, and that step is never taken through willpower alone. It requires surrender, not weakness, but sacred humility. And when that surrender happens, symbols begin to glow. Fire is no longer destruction, it is renewal. Darkness is no longer a prison. It is the womb of truth. What once broke you now opens you. Therapy can hold space. Spiritual practice can guide. But the soul must decide. The true turning point happens in the invisible, when a person finally says, "I'm ready to listen." And in that listening, the story changes. Addiction is no longer a cycle. It becomes a calling, a challenge, a sacred beginning. The pain is still there, but now it teaches, now it directs, now it becomes part of you. Healing is not about returning to who you were. It's about becoming someone who didn't exist before, someone born from the ashes because the soul passed through the fire. The symbol is not decoration. It is a key to a wider life, where the human being, by understanding themselves, makes peace with their story, with their pain, and with the mystery of being alive. And when the symbol takes root, life begins to rearrange itself. It's no longer about control or avoidance. It becomes about presence. The emptiness that once felt unbearable reveals its true nature. It was never absence. It was space. Space where something real could finally grow. Addiction, with all its darkness, becomes the imperfect language of a soul that only ever wanted to be heard. And when that listening is deep, compassionate, free of judgment, the need to escape begins to dissolve, because the journey toward wholeness was never about perfection. It was always about honesty, the courage to look within and not turn away. Healing is not forgetting. It is remembering that even in suffering, a seed of truth was waiting. Jung never offered easy answers. He offered a way, a path, so that each person find their own, because every addiction is a cry for meaning, and every healing is a return to the sacred, right there in the exact place where pain no longer needs explaining. True freedom begins